There are moments when we open the early pages of Scripture and feel as though we have stepped into unfamiliar territory. The names feel distant. The lifespans seem impossibly long. The genealogies, with their careful counting of years and generations, could appear at first glance like lists meant only for record-keeping. And yet, if we slow down and remain attentive, these passages begin to speak in quieter ways. They invite us to listen beneath the surface. They ask us to notice patterns, rhythms, and repetitions that were never meant to be accidental. What if these numbers were not merely measurements of time, but signposts pointing toward meaning? What if the structure itself was part of the message? From the opening chapters of Genesis, numbers appear again and again, woven into the story with intention. Days are counted, generations are traced, lives are measured, and as we walk patiently through these verses, we begin to sense that the biblical authors were doing more than preserving history. They were revealing something about God's order, God's faithfulness, and God's unfolding purpose across human time. This is Bible Scope, your place to find light, find truth, and find purpose. If this journey speaks to your heart, like the video and subscribe to walk through Scripture with us. As we move carefully through Genesis, especially through its early genealogies, we are invited into a world where numbers carry weight and meaning. In the ancient Near Eastern context, numbers were not only tools for counting. They were symbols, rich with cultural and spiritual significance. To the ancient listener, certain numbers immediately evoked ideas of completeness, order, covenant, or divine activity. The biblical writers shared this worldview, and they shaped their narratives accordingly. Genesis begins with a structured account of creation unfolding across 6 days, followed by a 7th day of rest. Even before genealogies appear, the reader is introduced to a numerical rhythm that reflects divine intentionality. The pattern is orderly, purposeful, and complete. The 7th day is not simply the next day in sequence. It is set apart. God rests, blesses, and sanctifies it. From the very beginning, the number 7 becomes associated with completeness and holiness, a theme that will echo throughout Scripture. When we later encounter genealogies, especially those in Genesis chapters 4, 5, 10, and 11, this same sense of order remains present. These lists are not chaotic. They are carefully shaped. They trace lines of descent with precision, connecting individuals across generations and anchoring the story of humanity within a divine framework. Genesis 5, for example, presents the genealogy from Adam to Noah. 10 generations are listed, beginning with Adam and ending with Noah. This is not a random number. In the biblical imagination, 10 often represents completeness or totality. It suggests a full cycle, a complete sequence. Just as the 10 Commandments later summarize God's covenantal law, these 10 generations form a complete era of human history, from creation to the flood. As we read slowly through Genesis 5, we notice a repeated pattern. A man lives a certain number of years, fathers a son, lives additional years, and then dies. The rhythm is steady, almost meditative. And yet, one phrase breaks the pattern like a quiet interruption. And he died. Again and again, the text reminds us of humanity's mortality. Even in long life, the consequence of the fall remains present. The numbers may be large, but the ending is the same. Then, in the midst of this repetition, a subtle variation appears. Enoch's story interrupts the rhythm. We are told that Enoch lived 365 years, and then instead of saying, "and he died," the text says, "and he walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." The number itself draws attention. 365 corresponds to the number of days in a solar year, a detail that ancient readers may have found symbolically fitting. Enoch's life, measured differently, feels complete in another sense, not through death, but through intimate fellowship with God. The genealogy then continues until it reaches the 10th generation, Noah. Noah's age, his sons, and his role in the coming flood are all carefully noted. Once again, numbers serve not only to measure time, but to frame meaning. The flood itself unfolds with numerical structure: 40 days of rain, 150 days of waters prevailing, precise timelines for the ark's resting and the earth's drying. The same God who ordered creation orders judgment and renewal with equal care. After the flood, Genesis 10 presents another genealogy, often called the Table of Nations. Here, the descendants of Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, are listed, resulting in 70 nations. In biblical thought, 70 often represents fullness among the nations. Later in Scripture, the 70 elders of Israel and the sending of 70 disciples by Jesus echo this sense of completeness. Genesis 10 is not merely a list of ancient peoples. It is a theological statement. All nations share a common origin. Humanity, though divided by language and geography, remains united by creation and accountable to one God. This sense of order becomes even clearer when we consider the genealogy of Shem in Genesis 11. Once again, 10 generations are listed, this time from Shem to Abram. The pattern mirrors Genesis 5, creating a literary bridge between the world before the flood and the world after it. The repetition of 10 generations signals another complete era, culminating not in judgment this time, but in calling. Abram emerges as the focal point of God's redemptive plan, and the numerical structure helps us feel the weight of that moment. Throughout these genealogies, numbers quietly reinforce the idea that history is not random. Generations unfold according to God's purpose. Even when human actions lead to chaos, such as the Tower of Babel, God's overarching plan remains intact. The scattering of languages does not undo God's intention. It prepares the way for a covenant that will eventually bless all nations. The number 12, though less prominent in Genesis's earliest genealogies, begins to appear as the story progresses. It will later define the structure of Israel through the 12 sons of Jacob. In Scripture, 12 often symbolizes organized community under God's covenant. Its roots can be traced back to these earlier numerical patterns, where order, completeness, and divine intention are consistently emphasized. That it is important as we reflect on these numbers, to avoid forcing meaning where Scripture does not clearly indicate it. The Bible does not invite us into hidden codes or secret calculations. Instead, it invites us into attentive reading. The symbolism of numbers emerges through repetition, context, and consistency across the biblical narrative. When we observe how certain numbers are used again and again in similar ways, we begin to understand their significance naturally, without speculation. The long lifespans recorded in Genesis have often raised questions. Some readers approach them scientifically, others symbolically. While interpretations vary, what remains clear is the theological message conveyed through these ages. Life is portrayed as abundant in the early chapters of Genesis, yet still finite. Time itself becomes a witness to both God's blessing and humanity's fragility. The gradual shortening of lifespans after the flood subtly reflects a changing world, one increasingly marked by limitation and dependence on God's promise. These genealogies also serve as bridges between stories. They slow the narrative, allowing the reader to reflect. They remind us that God works through generations, not just individuals. Faithfulness is rarely instantaneous. It unfolds across time, through families, through remembered names and counted years. As we walk through these passages together, we begin to see that the numbers in Genesis do more than organize information. They shape the way we understand God. They reveal a God who values order, who remembers each generation, and who weaves purpose into the flow of time. Nothing is wasted. No life is unnoticed. Even the names we might be tempted to skim over are held within God's attentive care. What does this reveal about humanity? It shows us that we are part of something larger than ourselves. Our lives are measured not only by years, but by our place within God's unfolding story. The genealogies remind us that we inherit both blessing and responsibility. We are shaped by those who came before us, and our choices echo into the future. What does this reveal about God? It reveals a God of patience and faithfulness, a God who works steadily, generation by generation, without haste and without forgetfulness, a God who brings order out of chaos, meaning out of repetition, and hope out of history. As modern readers, we may live in a culture that values speed and novelty. Genealogies challenge us to slow down. They teach us to honor continuity, to respect the quiet faithfulness of ordinary lives. They remind us that God's plan often advances not through dramatic moments alone, but through long obedience across time. When we allow ourselves to sit with these numbers, to read them attentively rather than rushing past them, we begin to hear their quiet testimony. They tell us that God is consistent, that God's promises endure, that history itself is held within God's hands. And perhaps this is the deepest invitation of all, to trust that our own lives, with their measured days and numbered years, are also known to God. That even when our stories feel ordinary, they are part of a greater narrative shaped by divine wisdom. As we've walked through this passage, what truth stood out to you? How might it shape the way you live today? If this exploration helped you grow, like the video and subscribe. Your journey through the pages is just beginning.